Well, thank you very much, Maureen, for inviting me, and also to those in Cardiff. It's my first visit to Cardiff. It's absolutely beautiful, so I'm delighted to be here. I'm really inspired by the introductions to today, and I was also inspired yesterday by a presentation by Professor Pat Brodie from Australia, who you may know works closely with Nikki Leith and others. And I first visited Australia in 2000, and I heard about the way in which they were mapping midwifery, which at that time was largely invisible. And Pat Brodie came and spoke to us about how midwifery has been put on the map, essentially, in Australia, through activism and through midwives becoming political. And that is my perspective, is that midwifery is political and has to be political. And my own spectacles through which I view the world come from political economy of health. And so today I'm going to focus on the ways in which political economy of health, and more specifically critical medical anthropology, can be applied to midwifery to illuminate political issues and to influence transformation and translation into practice. A bit about my own background. I guess I formed a lot of my views when I did a master's at Lancaster University, which I completed in 2000. And it was taught entirely by critical theorists and anthropologists. And really that was the first time that I actually started to consider where I was coming from politically and where I wanted to go and how I wanted that to feed into my own research. And I then went on and completed a PhD with Mavis Kirkham in 2004. And I conducted a critical ethnographic study in maternity units in the north of England. And it centred around the institutionalisation of infant feeding. And sometimes when I say, oh, my area of interest is maternal and child nutrition, infant and young child feeding, people sort of say, oh, how nice. But it is actually a very political issue. There are babies dying all over the world because of the cycle of nutritional deprivation. And it's a major issue with the Millennium Development Goals now. So I think the biggest insult anyone could pay to me was to see me as apolitical. I would like to be known as somebody who sees things from a political viewpoint and makes things happen through collective resistance, collective action, and through making political points. I think that has to be done sensitively and with caution and collaboratively, but I do see that we cannot not engage in politics as midwives. Okay, so just a brief overview then. I'm going to first of all focus on the application of critical medical anthropology to midwifery research, and then take you through a few snippets of critical ethnographic work. I'm not going to major on any particular piece of work, although I will draw on my own work, and also the work of Emily Martin, who was one of the first anthropologists to focus on the labouring body. So I'm going to be, by way of illustration of the critical medical anthropological approach, I'm going to focus on the labouring body, breastfeeding as labour, and the labouring midwife. And you have got a paper in your packs that I've written on social science and medicine called Supply and Demand, Breastfeeding as Labour, if you want a little bit more in-depth understanding of that. So critical medical anthropology is a subdiscipline of anthropology. Anthropology obviously involves going out and studying human cultures. It might be somewhere exotic, or it might be a local culture, for example, a hospital culture. So it can be conducted at a number of levels. Critical medical anthropology adopts a critical perspective to study of health and illness. Indeed, it's a critique of traditional medical anthropology, where people just went in and described, oh, this is happening, that is happening. Critical medical anthropology comes from a critical theory background. and in particular it's informed by political economy of health, which focuses on the relationship between capitalist modes of production, medical practice, health and illness. And the famous writings of Doyle and Pennell, right back in 1981, I would argue are still highly applicable today. Leslie Doyle focused on the contradictions between the goals of health promotion and the imperatives of capital accumulation. The ways in which medical practices and associated technologies have developed within societies that embrace the capitalist mode of production, and power relationships stemming from and contributing towards the development of multinational corporations. So they argue that we need to see health and healthcare practices in relation to the activities of powerful groups within society and power relationships that stem from them. So, for example, particular focus on multinational corporations such as medical equipment, pharmaceutical and food industries. They wield enormous power. It shifts our thinking towards the social organisation of healthcare and socio-economic divisions, unequal access to healthcare, and allows us to explore the social, political and economic roots of ill health within society and the need for socio-economic reform, and enables us to consider why we have not alleviated the overwhelming levels of morbidity and mortality occurring across the world. It also focuses on the iatrogenic nature of Western techno-medicine. In other words, how medicine can, in circumstances, make us sick. And the continuing demands within society for more medicine, and how these can be seriously misguided, because more of the same will not necessarily, and often not at all, tackle the social, political and economic roots of ill health within society. So political economy of health challenges the direction being taken by the public health movement. The obsessive focus on the individual as responsible for her or his health maintenance, placing the person centre stage for blame, and therefore shifting the focus away from the need for socio-economic reform. We can also criticise the rhetoric, the large rhetoric around equal access to healthcare through national services and the social organisation of medicine. The reality is that there are still socio-economic, sexual and racial divisions in healthcare. So, powerful statement that really Western capitalist modes of production have both contributed towards and failed to alleviate the enormous burden of disease and premature death still borne by the mass of the population in underdeveloped parts of the world. So it brings a critique of the practice of exporting Western medicine to non-Western communities, and recognises that biomedicine is of limited value in alleviating sickness and disease in large sections of the global population. In contrast, health-promoting techniques and drugs have been withheld or costed at prices that place them out of the reach of large sections of the population around the world, and the history of price fixing of drugs to combat AIDS is a powerful example. So, as Levin and Browner comment, 2 decades later, social inequalities continue to produce stark inequalities in health and healthcare for a wide-ranging groups and populations. So what does the political economy of health perspective support us in actually doing? Well, it enables us to make sense of the macro-political issues related to health and healthcare practices. By macro-political, I'm talking about issues around the medicalisation of everyday life, biomedicine as a form of power, domination and social control, and viewing the body as the sum of its component parts, as advocated by various so-called Enlightenment thinkers around the time that we had a sort of scientification, if you like, of life. While science has brought enormous benefits, it shouldn't go unchallenged in terms of its assumptions about the human body. And the intellectual debts are to Marx, Gramsci, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, Phenomenology and Political Economy. So this is the underpinning of critical medical anthropology. So critical medical anthropology in particular has agendas which include critique of medicine as an institution, cultural criticism focused on the domain of health, analysis of capitalism in the macro politics of healthcare systems, a focus on the micro politics of bodies and persons, additions of historical depth to cultural analysis, and critique of non-critical medical anthropology. So we would aim to add the traditional anthropological close-up view of local populations and their life ways, systems of meaning, motivations for action, points of view, and daily experiences and emotions to the encompassing holism of the political economy of health approach. So we're focusing on insights from political economy concerning what the system is, and micro, how the system works, to include how players act and feel and know, where the contradictions and arenas of social conflict lie, and how power is distributed and exercised. The micro focus, so that was the macro focus. The micro focus then, we moved down to focusing on a specific community, a group of people, or a particular organisation, such as the workings of a hospital. And we can study this aspect of a culture in some detail. And then we extend that micro perspective to probe further into the lived and embodied experiences of individuals within that context. So within the body that life is experienced and organised, and cannot be considered to be simply an expressive vehicle of a world inscribed by culture that surrounds the body. So we should not look at the mind being separated from the body, mental from material. We focus on the whole person's body from every perspective. And this, I'll come back to embodiment shortly. So there's a shift in focus from seeing the body as simply representational to understanding experiences stemming from the human body and embodied experiences, and the associated lived experiences of being within the world. And for this perspective, we can draw on phenomenological understandings. So, for example, Merleau-Ponty, who is a phenomenologist, whose work I particularly like, would argue that we should focus on several aspects of the human experience: embodiment, how we experience things within our body; spatiality, how we interpret space; relationships or intersubjectivity; and temporality. And if you think about your experience here, you are all experiencing aspects of those four here. You obviously you have an embodied experience of needing a drink, or feeling sleepy or alert. There's a spatial arrangement here. You've selected where you sat. There are relational aspects going on all the time here. Who we relate to, how we relate, how we judge people, and temporality, notions of time. So the critical medical anthropologist would see a person's body as active in its own construction, viewing people as active agents with many sociocultural constraints upon them. That's really important, because one would hope that there's a balance between seeing the structural constraints upon people and and their health and individual agency. So whilst we are all very influenced by our culture and inscribed by our culture, we also have agency, both individually and collectively, within that culture. And critical medical anthropology is always seeking to tease out that balance within specific groups, organisations, about how enculturation balances with individual agency. So we can capture ideas of ideology, power, conflict and oppression and seek to be transformative. In other words, merge theory with social action. So again, it's very focused on not sitting back while the world burns, if you like, but actually being prepared to take social action based on what we illuminate in our work. So that's really very central. Just to add, and I won't go into depth on this, you'll be relieved to hear, critical medical anthropology does incorporate, with caution, aspects of feminism, post-structuralism and postmodernism. And if you want to read a little bit more about the way critical medical anthropology has progressed to be more inclusive, then you'll see that reference in your pack. So critical ethnography is actually a methodology that is closely aligned in its theoretical underpinnings to critical medical anthropology. And there are a number of people who have conducted ethnographic work here. I was very impressed by Sheila's work, The Social Union of Midwifery, which was an ethnographic study. Yeah, and I was looking back at that actually this week and really enjoying it. So thank you for that, Sheila. And you know, and Mavis Kirkham's work has also been very influential in terms of, and she has brought a political perspective to ethnography. So ethnography per se involves the eliciting of cultural knowledge, both explicit and tacit, with the latter constituting taken for granted and therefore hidden forms of knowledge. And Spradley was one of the famous early authors around that. He commented that what we see represents only the thin surface of a deep lake, and beneath the surface, hidden from view, lies a vast reservoir of cultural knowledge. And I think that's really the key to ethnography, that you're digging deeper to get to that vast reservoir of unspoken, tacit knowledge. With critical ethnography, it is a particular way of doing ethnography through a particular theoretical lens. The specific approach is underpinned by notions of ideology, power and control, and that is central to the research process. So the ethnographer actually seeks out and opens up to scrutiny power relationships and assumptions that do lead to oppression, inhibition, repression and constraint upon individuals and communities. So if you like, the critical ethnographer comes in unapologetically saying, I'm open to what I see, but I do want to tease out some of these issues. I want to look at ideologies, power and control as part of my work. Now some people would argue that that is a blink of view. If you come in looking for power, you'll find it. And of course there is a critique around it based on that. And it's a very interesting debate to have. But it does demand a call to action, ranging from challenging existing assumptions to political activism. And it is concerned with emancipation, so the process of separation from constraining modes of thinking or acting that limit perception of action, and social domination of specific groups. So as Thomas argues, it is an appeal to our wild side. It invokes a call to reject inhibitions imposed by assumed meanings, and to cultivate in their place the fiercely passionate and undomesticated side of our scholarly nature that challenges preconceived ideas. Okay, so a critical ethnographer immerses oneself in the community or setting to be studied. And we should always avoid the comfortable sense of being at home, which impedes our ability to see and hear what is really happening. So the ethnographer puts herself or himself into a marginal position, to be a fly in the wall position really, if you like. A point between familiarity and strangeness. And that's very challenging to do. Very central to critical ethnography, and not exclusive to critical ethnography, is reflection. And true reflection does indeed lead to action, as Paulo Freire, in his amazing text, Pedagogy of the Impressed, highlights. So it's a rejection of the sort of bracketed ethnography, where the researcher is inevitably influenced by her own socio-economic background and personal, political and intellectual values and beliefs. So a profound level of self-awareness is needed to capture the perspectives through which we do indeed see the world and the filters through which we experience the world. And there is a constant reflection on power processes, power issues, related to a number of aspects of the research. The language we use, our position as a researcher in the field, our relationship with our participants, and the way we represent others' perspectives, and we need to always bear in mind how we represent the voices of others. Whilst wanting to do that, we are also constructing the way we present others' voices, and that requires caution. Okay, so I'm going to focus on now really to look at the labouring body. And just really very briefly, I'd just like to mention that Emily Martin, who wrote The Woman in the Body, which is a really stunning text and was very much influenced me, conducted work in the 1980s, so things have changed and moved on, fortunately. But not enough, probably, definitely. But the women that she interviewed and observed spoke about, when they were actually giving birth, feeling like they really were labourers. And, of course, that is why the word labour has come about. But more than that, in the sense of a production process. So they felt they were viewed as the labourer, whilst their uterus was viewed as the machine, baby the product, the doctor the factory supervisor or owner. In her text, the midwife wasn't even mentioned. This was in America, probably because she was largely invisible in that particular arena. And I think what she was saying at the outset of today's presentation was illustrative of that. And the language we see in the 1958 version of Margaret Miles alludes to that, those metaphors being predominant. And indeed, education of student midwives has been and still uses metaphors around this process. And you have the uterus as machine and the fetus as the passenger. Was it the uterus as passages? And the oh yes, the uterus as power, the fetus as the passenger, and the pelvis passage. Yes, something like that anyway, but you get the meaning. Yes, so interestingly, Robbie Davis Floyd, who's also an anthropologist, an American anthropologist, some years later, talked about the way American women had actually moved on in terms of their conceptualization. They no longer felt oppressed in the sense that they felt they were like labourers, but they were actually starting, indeed half of them, her large cohort of women she interviewed, were now conceptually fused with the technocratic model of birth. And I'm sure Marley will talk about that a bit more later. But so they were actually aligned conceptually to the technocratic model of birth and saw it as useful and liberating and enabling them to control things and know when the baby would be born. The elective caesarean section, of course, being the ultimate in knowing what was going to happen. I use the term control advisedly there. So my own work, I wanted to look further at not at the labouring body, but at the breastfeeding body, the woman who was breastfeeding, and I wanted to focus on women's experiences of breastfeeding within the institutionalised settings in the north of England. And I was particularly interested in the north of England because it has a very Victorian heritage, and the hospitals are based basically on factories, and some of them still are, and also, of course, on the prison, where everybody can be seen, including workers and service users. There's a strong surveillance aspect to all care given and received. And you can read more about that in my monograph, which stemmed from my own PhD work. You may have come across it, but it's published by Routledge, and it's called Breastfeeding in Hospital, Mothers, Midwives and the Production Line. I've got some flyers here. But the whole background is to focus on the way in which institutions developed in England and were indeed based on prisons and factories, and how that influences care today. I'm not going to go through in detail the methodology of it, because that isn't my purpose today, and you can read that in the paper. But I did focus very specifically on 2 consultant-led maternity units in the north-west of England, and I had 61 breastfeeding women participating and 39 midwives, and I observed 97 encounters between midwives and mothers, and 106 focused interviews with postnatal women, and 37 interviews with midwives. And the data was transcribed, and I had I did 3 readings of it. First of all, a holistic reading for the general plot. Then I used a thematic networks analysis, focusing on global organising and basic themes. And finally, a critical reading focusing on ideology, power and control. So in terms of women's experiences of infant feeding, and this was first published in 2005, so it's quite recent really. Women in the north of England, in these particular settings, which were typical hospitals in the north of England, still saw their bodies as means of production. They tended to see their breasts as functioning to make milk and deliver it and transfer it to the baby. They had a deep mistrust of their body's ability to produce the correct amount and quality of the product, breast milk. And they generally doubted their ability to deliver the product to the baby. So you can see I'm deliberately using industrial metaphors there to illustrate how the women spoke about their own experiences. I'm not going to trot out a whole load of quote material to you. This is really a summary, but you can read some of the quotes in the paper in the pack. But a general comment like "it is not working" is a mechanistic way of describing breastfeeding. So first, women talked about supply, and of course we talk about demand and supply when we refer to breastfeeding. So we use industrial metaphors to start with. But supply actually relates to commodity production and delivery, and so when you see something as in those ways, then the mother may start to see herself as the producer and start to feel alienated from the product. The term demand relates to consumption, of course. To the requirements of the consumer, in this case the baby, which in turn dictates supply. And physiologically that is the case, and it is actually quite a neat way of describing the baby suckles more, then the mother produces more milk. But the whole language around getting source A to source B, from the mother to the baby, overrides notions of relationality and fixates the mother's mind on measures of well-being that are largely unhelpful, like obsession with weighing, etc. So the notions of demanding at uncertain times and in uncertain places brings about an irregularity and indeterminacy. And it's contrary to our notions of orderly eating, according to a linear time frame. So in the way that mothers, certainly in Robert Davis Freud's work, have become conceptually fused to notions of certainty in labour and birth, a lot of women prefer certainty with regards to infant feeding. And of course the whole notion of demanding links very much with the production line. So the removal of culturally ingrained linear temporal markers from a lived and embodied process create considerable discord in people's minds, or in some people's minds, when living within a very linear society focused on efficiency and production and everything by the clock. So breastfeeding in this way can be seen as unidirectional and demanding, in need of control and in some cases supplementation. So this represents an extension of Emily Martin's theorising on the breastfeeding, on the labouring body. As you can see now, breastfeeding has become the time-driven process. The woman is now the labourer. The breasts are the machines. Breast milk is the product. The baby is now the consumer, and the midwife is the supervisor. So you can see how one piece of anthropological theory informed the findings of another, and helped to make sense of it. Although we should be cautious about a priori assumptions. We shouldn't think, well, now such a body said this, I'll make my work fit with that. That wasn't the way it worked out. Sometimes the way one presents it looks as if it's been a linear progression in that way, but it shouldn't be. The way an ethnographer would look at the data and then search for ways of making sense of that data based on other people's theorising, conceptualising in the literature. So it's little wonder that women actually think breastfeeding is working well when they're producing a good quality and plentiful product, breast milk. Finally, I'd like to focus on the labouring midwife, and I actually published a chapter in Billy Hunter and Ruth Deary's book, which is, remind me of the exact title, Emotions in Midwifery and Childbirth, is it?
Emotions in Midwifery and Reproduction.
Emotions in Midwifery and Reproduction, that's a plug for you, Billy, which is an excellent book. And I wrote a chapter in there called No Time to Care, Midwifery Work on Postnatal Wards. And this is really interesting because I thought I was going to go in and do a study and I was going to observe interactions and then interview midwives following that about the interactions. But that wasn't the case. I was actually standing behind what they called the nurse's station, which should have been the midwife station, but never mind. And midwives would come to me and say, right, I'm ready to be interviewed now. And they would actually say, right, I don't really want to talk about infant feeding. I don't want to talk about this interaction. I want to tell you what life is like working here. And it was far more interesting than anything I'd really set out. But because I've got ethical approval to do a full ethnography and observe everything, I could actually listen to these stories as related to my own work. Because what they would always start by saying, it's all very well people saying that we should be doing X, Y, and Z, but these are the reasons that this isn't happening this way. And they would talk about the temporal constraints upon them, the constraints upon them in terms of embodiment, the spatial constraints, and relational aspects of their work. And they saw unrelenting pressure on their time in these particular settings as a source of oppression. And it was particularly interesting by way of contextualising my study. And really with a critical ethnographic approach, that is essential. To write a study without that contextualisation is missing the point. We can also talk about the labouring midwife. As Foucault famous post-structuralist who wrote Discipline and Punish, the Birth of the Prison. As he commented, the labourer's or worker's body is not only productive, but it's also subjective. So midwives felt that they were the focus was on their productivity, but they also felt subjected because demand was constantly outstripping supply. The time pressures were investing their body, marking them, training them, torturing them, forcing them to carry out tasks, performing ceremonies and emit signs. So that was particularly interesting in terms of the macro and micro perspective. So obviously there are political issues there that need to be raised. And I really liked the quote by Lynch. We have lost our understanding of the rhythm of work and rest in many settings, not all settings, and things have improved some places and got worse in others. Of being as well as doing, of recognising the need for spaces of contemplation, meditation and mediation. And I think Dennis Walsh's work around birth centres particularly illuminates that. So the socio-political perspective to this study is that we still are working largely within institutionalised maternity care systems. And we still see infused through many of the aspects of the culture notions of efficiency and time-driven productivity, and they mirror what we see in industrialised communities. And I would argue there's still a lack of understanding of the nature of caring and the needs of carers. And of course, Billy's book focuses very specifically on that whole area of emotion work in midwives and health workers. And so in terms of socio-political change, the challenges to us are we do need to constantly challenge institutionalised care and practices. We've moved on in some areas, we've slipped back in others, and other areas we've just gone round in circles. And we need to constantly reflect on that. How we utilise place and space. We need to rethink embodiment and how we conceptualise our own bodies, the metaphors we use around bodies. Reconceptualise time and really rethink about what do we really care about, what matters, and how can we build time into those practices. Revision the importance of relationships between midwife to midwife, midwives to mothers, and of course there are many great initiatives that have supported that, but we still have a long way to go. And reconfiguring our knowledge and mechanistic language. I'd just like to finish with a poem, and then I'm sure you'll be ready for your coffee, tea. And this is by Rachel Vigier in Foreman and Soughton, and it's an amazing book called Taking Our Time, Feminist Perspectives on Temporality. And it was written in 1989, but nevertheless I think it's highly relevant today. It was for us a cycle until you marked a return, notches on bone, later found and theorised upon as marvels of primitive ingenuity. When it was for us, you were feverishly measuring, calculating a life carried by one of ours. At first we were surprised by these crude measurements and laughed as a group at these plottings of our body. It seemed not to matter. You continued, and with this obsession, and we dismissed it. When the moment comes, we will let you know, it seems we once said. But you counted backwards, and now your measured fact tells us what once we knew beforehand. The first mark of time was against us, and you continue to march your numbers through our souls, where out of habit and weariness too, we have made a place for you. Thank you.